junctures from Liverpool, England.
People all over the world are just beginning to talk about the Beatles.
My model of business is the Beatles. You know, they were four very talented guys.
1, 2, 3.
Hello, my name's Paul McCartney.
This is Ringo Starr. This is John Lennon.
I'm George Harrison.
Welcome back to the Here, There, and Everywhere podcast. I'm your host, Jack Lawless. Today we're talking with Jonathan Pretus, who's a musician and a host of one of the best Beatles podcasts out there, Ranking the Beatles. Each episode of Ranking the Beatles features Jonathan and his wife, Julia, diving deep into each Beatles song, in the order that Jonathan has ranked them, starting with his least favorite to his favorite Beatles song of all time. For each of their episodes, they invite a new guest on the show to discuss each song, and fun fact, I was actually a guest on one of their episodes discussing the Beatles song Real Love. So go check out their podcast if you're not already subscribed. In this episode, Jonathan and I discuss the Beatles music, what it's like to run a Beatles podcast, and a lot more. I hope you enjoy this episode.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on the Here, There, and Everywhere podcast. How are you doing today?
Thanks, Jack. I'm good, man. It's good to see you. Glad to finally make it on here.
Yeah, I've been wanting to have you on for a while, especially since I kind of had my personal Beatles podcast debut appearance on your show a few years ago.
Were we the first one you did? I didn't know that.
Yeah, that was the first podcast.
I didn't remember that.
Great icebreaker.
Man, that's awesome. Nice. Well, I will take all the credit and all the blame for any success or failures you are currently experiencing.
So, Jonathan, can you tell us about your podcast, Ranking the Beatles, for anyone who hasn't heard it yet?
Yeah. Well, as you said, it's called Ranking the Beatles. Kind of the premise of the show is I ranked the entire catalog of the Beatles from, now here's the caveat, least favorite to most favorite. I'm not saying worst to best because I don't believe there is a bad song in the catalog. I love them all, but it was really kind of something that was born out of boredom during COVID originally. Just sitting around one weekend and wondering if I could rank the entire catalog. So I sat in the kitchen and put everything into a spreadsheet and spent a few days just kind of listening to songs and thinking about it, and made this list. And then originally I was just posting, kind of daily posts on Facebook during lockdown when we started it. And then about a couple weeks in, a few people started saying, hey, this should be a podcast. What would you think about doing that? And after enough people suggested it, that's kind of where I turned my attention to with it. But the premise is every week, every episode, we discuss a different song in the list. We work our way from started at 223, working our way down to number 1. We have a different guest on, usually a musician or a writer or a Beatles, related person to come on and talk about the next song and kind of their history with the band and their fandom, and kind of just talk about the band and, do the thing that we all love to do and talk about the Beatles.
Mm. And when you first started your show, what were the biggest challenges you faced? Was it difficult breaking into the Beatles podcast world? Because I know a few podcasts started during COVID. Did you find it challenging at all? Was it easy for you?
It was interesting. I knew of a couple of Beatles podcasts at the time that I listened to. I didn't know how many there were. I didn't realize how many there were. And I didn't realize kind of the extent of like online Beatles fandom, especially like on Twitter. And so once I started, I kind of just started meeting all these people through it who were all just so nice and so fun to chat with. And it was great. The challenges I found was that the content that was out there was so good. I didn't want to put out something that was crappy. So I tried to make sure that like our production was good. Our guests were interesting. We were interesting. I was really concerned at the beginning about like trying to catch all like the weird little kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? All the weird little kind of things that you say when you're talking on a microphone that you inevitably want to like cut out because you don't need to say 1,000 times, Or I learned that like my weird thing is I would go, love it, love it. I have no idea why I would say that. I never say that in conversation. Never. So yeah, trying to kind of get past that was different. Because I'm used to being on a microphone and recording as a musician, but like recording conversation was different. So kind of learning to figure out my voice in terms of how that works was a challenge. But it was fun, and I met, so many great people through it that it kind of made itself easier the more I just did it. And the more I found the version of myself that I wanted to put across in the podcast seemed to reveal itself over time. And so it feels real natural, and it feels easy, and it's something that's really, really fun. And it's also just given me a new outlet for creativity, and it's very, very fun. So I love being part of the Beatles podcast community and world. It's so interesting. There's so many great people making great content out there, and keeping this band in the zeitgeist.
Yeah. Yeah, when I first started my podcast, I had some trouble listening back to, the first few conversations because, usually you don't tape your own conversations. So when you do listen back for the first time, you're like, oh, do I sound like that?
Right.
Oh.
Yeah.
Why am I saying that? So how long did it take for you to be able to find your voice and to find the version of yourself who's a welcomed representative of a Beatles fan?
I think it probably took me at least a year to feel comfortable with what I heard when I listened to it. And it took me a long time to get used to the sound of my own voice as a singer. Like it wasn't until I was in my 30s that I kind of understood, like, okay, that's just what my voice is. Like, accept it and be happy with it, and not be happy with it, but accept it and own it. And so it took me a while to kind of find the same thing in speaking and recording those conversations. And I think what happened that kind of made it a quicker turn was realizing somewhat quickly that people were listening to the show and enjoying it who were not just like my 5 closest friends, like people that I did not know were writing in and saying, hey, we really enjoy this show. We enjoy your take on things. We enjoy the rapport between you and your wife, because for those of you who don't know, my wife co-hosts the show with me. I'm like the role of the super fan. She is the casual, more level-headed fan of the two of us. But people really enjoyed kind of the dynamic and the way that we talk. And when people were enjoying it, it makes it easier to go, oh, well, I guess this doesn't suck. I think I probably felt more confident after the first year, though, which it kind of blew my mind to think like, oh God, we're in year 4 now. Like we're just hitting like our 4-year anniversary soon, which is bonkers.
Wow. So Coming up on year 4, have any of your rankings changed since you started the show?
Oh man. Yes. And I don't know if I talked about it with you when we had you on. Let's see. What song did we do? I'm looking back. We did Real Love.
Yeah, we did Real Love.
We did Real Love, which I had ranked at number 151 out of 223. I mean, the first problem now is that now there's 224 songs.
That's right.
Because we didn't have Now and Then when I started this list. So now I've got to redo the whole damn thing. But I will say, there are some songs that I feel that I've found, through the episodes that I've done with the songs, there have been occasions where a guest has really flipped my perspective on things. One such example was Octopus's Garden. We had this band, the Beths, on. They're from New Zealand. They're fantastic. And they really brought up this idea that like, maybe this song is really a bit more autobiographical about Ringo than you would ever think. Because on the surface, it's just this kind of like easy rhyme, like kind of children's song almost, but it's like, no, this is a guy looking for solace while the world around him is collapsing. And it's like, oh, well, hold on. That's actually a way deeper idea. And that kind of blew my mind a little bit. So there have been other things where like, I've just gone to do the episode and kind of been like, what was I thinking? Like when I ranked this, like, was I in a bad mood that day? So for some reason, whatever song just landed at like 122. I don't know. But I do think I'm going to do a thing towards the end of this enterprise that I'm calling the Great Re-Ranking, where when I get to like the top 10 or maybe the top 20, I'm going to, or maybe it's even at the tail end of the show, I don't know. I'm going to look and kind of reassess and see what I would move around blank number of years later, however many years it is. I will take another pass at it. I think a lot of things will stay the same. I will contend, I think my top 10 will stay the same. I know my number 1 and 2 will stay the same. I've learned through a lot of guests that we have, will say that like their favorite changes every day. And I get that. Like, I think that's a really interesting thing about this band that's very different from a lot of other bands. There are so many songs that are so great, they could be your favorite Beatles song that day, and then it could change the next day. I've had the same favorites for a long time, like the same top 2 that I know are one. I know why number 1 is number 1, and I know why number 2 is number 2, and those have been like concrete for years. So I think some things will change, some will stay the same, but I've got a ways to go before we get to the Great Re-Ranking. I'm not looking forward to it. It's a lot of brain work when the time comes.
So you think Now and Then is going to sneak its way into the top 10 for you?
Probably not top 10. I've been debating how to assess Now and Then, how to work that into the list, because I don't want to wait until I'm done with everything to try to kind of approach it then. So I think I'm waiting until at least a year. So I guess that'll be November will be a year, and I'll probably try to kind of ballpark it and maybe not give it a number, like a definite number, but maybe I could say it's in the top 150, or maybe it's in top 100. I don't know. Maybe I can even, kind of shoehorn it, like it's between 75 and 100, or trying to figure out something like that, just to at least give it a temporary holding spot. And then when I do reapproach everything, try to really position it somewhere. But I really love this song. I'm a big fan of that song. What did you think of it?
I loved it.
Yeah.
I'll buy anything they release.
Right. Right.
When it came out, I listened to it on repeat for like 2 weeks. I love it. What can you not like about it? I've talked to a few musicians and producers who said the track was overproduced. There's not enough space between the tracks. It was brick walled.
I'll agree with that. I think that's an interesting point, because, and I think this rang true in the 90s with Free as a Bird and Real Love. And I think even George Martin commented, there's so much happening production wise in Real Love and Free as a Bird, in some ways to kind of like detract from the quality of the source tape of John's vocal. You want to kind of like, hey, look at all this other pretty stuff over here, and don't worry about this kind of crappy tape quality over here. But I do think there's a lot of things going on in Now and Then, and also just modern production is louder, and the remixes of everything are louder because everything has to compete in streaming platform now. And the idea is that, and I think Danny Harrison and probably Sean Lennon have both commented on this, that the goal with the remixes, and Giles has probably said this too, the goal is for a song to be in a Spotify playlist and sound like it belongs with whatever contemporary songs it is in between. It shouldn't sonically be a total outlier. So I get that, because that does keep it kind of current for modern ears. I do get where people don't want that, because they want to hear it the way they've always heard it. But I can see how a new song would have to fit that criteria as well, because they were pushing it to be a contemporary song. But yeah, I thought it was really well done for what it was. I enjoy that it's a part of the catalog. I think it's a gorgeous song. When I hear it now, 8 months later, I love it. I'll listen to it it'll come on the Sirius XM Beatles channel, and it's like, yep, this fits. I'm a fan of this. I think it's a big win. I love it.
It does fit. It does fit in very nicely with the rest of their songs. It doesn't sound like this is a song they did 50 years later. It sounds like a Beatles song. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting. I think it's also interesting, like, not a lot of other bands have really done this kind of thing where the band physically does not exist in some fashion, but somehow they can continue their story and keep building this legacy of, creating art in situations where there should be no new creation, but finding a way to do it that is authentic and real and beautiful and really interesting. They're creating, I think, a new kind of path forward for bands that have legacies and bands that go on for however, most bands aren't together, 60 years. The Rolling Stones are like the rare exception to the rule, but a lot of bands that have, their physical time together has ended and maybe someone is gone, but if the rest of them are still together and wanting to create and have access to things, they can still do stuff and they can still make that entity live in some fashion. I think is a really interesting concept, for art, for a way for art to continue.
Yeah. And, I think it's kind of like completely unique to the Beatles in a way where like it's not even just music, but it's also movies. Like Get Back was a completely new experience of that time period.
Mm-hmm.
And these movies that they continue to put out, we get a new surprise every year. Sometimes I wonder what's left.
Yeah.
Like
right.
How much is
like,
there?
There's so much in their archives. It's, and as fans, we want all of it.
Yeah.
Like, I imagine you're in the same boat as me of like, okay, well, you found 56 hours of unused footage for Get Back. You gave us 8. Where's the rest of it?
Yeah,
just give me a Dropbox link. I will give you my credit card, let me have all of it. Yeah. I'll take whatever they put out. I really will.
Yeah. Same.
It's rare that I decide not to get something that they put out. This weekend was one of those rare occasions actually, where I was in a record store and the Mind Games EP from Record Store Day, they had a copy of it. And I picked it up and I had a few other things in my hand and it's like, man, $35 for a 4-song EP is strong. I just can't justify that today. So I put that back, but I might pick it up another time. I'll inevitably get the box set for it anyway, but yeah.
So Jonathan, now that you're on year 4 of your podcast, do you have any favorite episodes that you've done?
I thought about that when you sent over the questions and it's hard to pick one, I think I'm really proud of the way we handled Run for Your Life. I think we did a really good nuanced conversation about that one, which is not a favorite song by any stretch. I mean, it's okay. I mean, rhythmically it's cool, but there's a lot to unpack in a song like that, especially through 2024 or I guess 2022 is when we did it, but just through modern day, eyes, there's a lot to unpack on that song, but I think we did a really good job with that. So that's one I'm really proud of. I really, the episodes that I get to do with people that we've met through this undertaking and become close with have been some of the ones that are the most fun, where I feel like we've laughed the most and had the most fun doing them. So it's been, doing stuff with the guys from Blotto Beatles or Sam from Paul or Nothing, or the girls from Another Kind of Mind, or BC the Beatles, or Gary and Paul from Big Beatles Sort Out. Those episodes are super fun. And then the ones where I've had musicians who I'm a big fan of their work and maybe didn't know them, but they are Beatles fans and we're up for talking about the Beatles. So those have been great. Dave Depper from Death Cab for Cutie, or Mike Viola, or Sean Nelson. Those have been fun because it's people whose art I respect and am a fan of, and we have this mutual shared admiration of the Beatles. So that's, those are fun. And crossovers with other podcasts are super fun. I don't know that I have a definite favorite, but there's groups that have been, the most fun, which I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but I've never not had fun doing it. That's the thing, is even if sometimes you're just not in the mood to do something. You're dreading that you have to do a podcast at 6 o'clock. You're like, oh, I don't want to do this today. Yeah, but inevitably, when you get on and you start talking about this thing that you love with somebody who loves the same thing, it's like, oh yeah, this is why we do this, because this is so much fun and it's what I want to be doing anyway. So I always love, doing these. It's so much fun.
Yeah, no, it really is. And, that's one of my favorite things about Beatles podcasting now as well. if that's even a verb.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, yeah. It's like a cottage industry now.
Yeah. But just doing these podcasts is so energizing, especially when you talk to people who really love the Beatles. I can't tell you how many times one of my guests has said, like, oh, I could talk about them all night. I could talk about this music forever.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, it really is just the best.
Yeah. I will say, as I'm thinking about it also, an episode that I do think is another favorite that I'm really proud of was our episode on Revolution 9. Because that is a song that there is no moderate fan of Revolution 9. You either like it or you don't, and there is no in between. And I understand it, and my goal was not to tell anyone, and my goal is never to tell anyone that they're wrong in their preference or their thought. My goal was to present the idea of challenging your thought of what constitutes a song, and challenging the idea of the bravery it takes to throw everything you know about music out the window and put something like that on an album that is going to sell millions of copies and be in millions of people's homes, I think is an incredibly bold move. And I think as a piece of music in whatever form it kind of is, it's the kind of thing you can listen to 100 times and hear 100 brand new things. And I think that is infinitely fascinating, because I can say I've heard every single nuance in Sexy Sadie. I've heard everything I can hear in Do You Want to Know a Secret? But every time I listen to Revolution 9, I hear something new. And I find that to be a really singular, interesting thing that only exists in that particular song. So that's an episode. And I had a number of people reach out and say, hey, I really understand what you're saying, and I dig that, and I think that's really cool. I still don't like it, but you've made me appreciate what they're doing. And so I was like, you know what? If you appreciate it, that's cool. I dig that. I'm happy about that. So that was one I thought was really successful. The idea that everyone can have different perceptions on a song and different takes on the same thing, because art is so subjective and everyone can hear something totally different, which it doesn't mean that it's wrong, or that it's right. It's just that one person's opinion. It's the way that they hear it, the way they see it. And I think that's, such a cool thing to explore, especially in terms of music that is so well known. People hear it so differently. So I love talking about that.
So I'd love to pick your brain about
Okay.
a few recent articles that I've seen regarding Beatles news.
Ooh, okay.
So have you seen the rumored Beatles cast for the upcoming biopics directed by Sam Mendes?
I have, and I pulled up an article about it here so I could look while we talk about it.
So what do you think of the cast selection, and what are you ultimately hoping to get from these official biopics that are coming out in 2027?
The thing I was thinking when they first announced this was, I hope it's for people I've never seen in my life, because I've seen the Beatles so many times. I've visually looked at these four guys millions of times in my life. I really know what they look like. I know what their mannerisms are. I know how they talk. It's really hard when you see somebody trying to pretend to be that. And it's always been weird like that, whether it was in Backbeat or, Birth of the Beatles was another one. Any of those movies, they're always weird. And more often than not, they come off kind of goofy. So because you get the guy with the big eyes is Paul, and the guy with the big nose is Ringo, and the guy with the pointy nose is John, but they never look anything other than those one defining characteristics. So I kind of hope it's someone I've never seen and have no preconceived notions about. And I don't know who any of these four guys are, which I guess is a great thing. I guess it's what I wanted. As I'm looking at them, I don't see really any visual similarities. Maybe, is it Paul Mescal?
Yeah, Mescal, I think.
Maybe he kind of looks like McCartney. Maybe his name is Paul, so that's a bonus.
Yeah.
This guy who's supposed to be John looks nothing like John whatsoever. The guy who looks like Ringo, he's got the big nose. So I see that, which I guess is better than prosthetics. The George guy looks nothing like George to me. I guess maybe a little. I don't know. It's so hard. So my hope is that, did you see the Brian Wilson movie, Love and Mercy?
Yes.
When that came out?
Love that one.
By like the second half of the movie, I totally bought John Cusack as Brian Wilson. The first half, It was like, this is just John Cusack in a leather jacket. Like, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
But then at some point, the acting was so good, it worked.
Mm-hmm.
I'm hoping that the writing and the acting is good enough that any perceived visual difference I have is gone. And it's just the character takes over. I think the idea behind how they're doing it is awesome. Like 4 intertwining films, I think is great. I was really hoping they weren't going to try and cram this into like a 2-hour thing. So I'm hoping everyone gets a real honest look at their stories and not just like the hits of here's what happened between 62 and 70, but like what made these 4 guys the person that they were individually. Like what created these 4 personalities? Because I think that's a very important part of the story that often gets kind of glossed over. So like, it's important to know, why did Paul have this hardcore drive to be successful? Why did John have these like deep-seated insecurities that he shoved way down and, was this boisterous character? I think things like that are really important to explore. And you kind of only get one shot at like a big thing like this. Like Backbeat was like a small kind of indie film, and they haven't really done like the big Hollywood thing. So I think this will be kind of like the one shot, and I hope they get it right. I'm 100% going to go see it. I'll see all of them. I'm hoping to not cringe a whole bunch, I guess, is like my biggest expectation. Like, I think it's good that like all the 2 estates and Paul and Ringo are all involved. I'm assuming they'll have some kind of, veto power on something, but I'm just hoping it's good. Like, I don't want it to be cheesy. I don't want it to be goofy. I just want it to be good because I think they deserve something that is that good. So that's kind of where I'm sitting on it. I'm not a big movie person. I don't go to movies all that often. I tend to just kind of watch them at home, but I'll definitely be going to the theater to see all these. I also hope that they don't release Ringo's last. Like, don't do that to the man. Like, give us Ringo second.
Yeah.
Go John, yeah. Ringo, George, Paul. Like, that's how you got to do it.
Yeah. That'd be a great release schedule.
Yeah.
I agree with your thoughts about the Beatles biopics because, it seems like all of the Beatles biopics that have been released are all kind of goofy.
Yeah.
And, you watch a biopic like Bohemian Rhapsody that came out about Queen, or even Love and Mercy, like you mentioned before, and they work. But for some reason, when it's done for the Beatles, it hasn't worked so far. And, I wonder, is that because of budgeting issues, or is that just because, I don't know, is it something about their personalities that just can't be nailed by actors?
I think it's a combination of like in the past, they've never had the budget or the permission to use the music. So like with Backbeat, you had the songs that they were covering in Hamburg. And granted, it didn't go into that time frame, but like they're going to have the Beatles recordings in these films. And then also like their voices are such a part of their character that the voice has become cartoonish when it's, done by other people. Like it just becomes like kind of a joke, not a joke, but like it becomes funny. And inevitably in every biopic, there's that moment of some kind of stupid, like aha moment where like, I know this didn't happen in Love and Mercy, but like you'd have Brian Wilson be like, what if we were surfing in the USA?
Yeah.
And then he writes this song. Like they always do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's like, please just don't do that. Like, don't give us like the kitschy weird moments, like don't invent a thing to make it fun, like to make it, cinematic. So, I mean, the story itself is cinematic enough that like, it doesn't need that help. No one needs to create some, fictitious event of like, just silliness that doesn't exist because it fits a trope. We don't need tropes with these guys.
Yeah, totally agree. And speaking
Yeah.
of Beatles movies, have you seen the new Let It Be movie?
Yes.
Well,
yes.
the old Let It Be movie, but
Yeah.
the one Peter
Yeah.
Jackson remastered. What were your thoughts on that one?
Like you, I'm sure I enjoyed you. I'm sure you enjoyed watching, 73 minutes or whatever it is of Beatles footage. I still find it to be an oddly edited, weird, disjointed kind of movie. It's a weirdly composed film for my personal aesthetic of what I like in a film. It just kind of jumps around a lot. The editing's strange, but I think it also tells a story of like a session that was kind of unfocused for the most part. And I think that's reflected in the film, which is probably really appropriate. They do often seem kind of unfocused and kind of randomly just jumping from, cover to cover until they kind of get their backs against the wall, and then it kind of takes off. But I enjoyed it. I don't know that I will watch it often because I find Get Back to be such a more enjoyable watch. Like the way that the story is told is more interesting. It kind of just ticks the boxes more for me. It's got a flow to it. It kind of keeps you engaged. Whereas there were times when I watched Let It Be and I'd seen it, on YouTube and kind of like, blurry, dark, copies of copies converted into a YouTube video. So I'd seen it before, but like it always kind of got to the point of like, when does something happen? So I'm glad it's out there for historical sake and for completion's sake. I don't know that I will watch it a ton. I might watch it from time to time, but I think it's more something I would maybe put in the background if I was like just doing some work on my laptop in the living room and wanted to have the TV on. Then yeah, you know what? I'll put Let It Be on. That's fine. But yeah, I'm glad it's out there. What did you think?
Oh, same exact thoughts. Like literally the same exact thoughts.
Yeah.
I thought it was, I'm not crazy about the movie. I thought the Peter Jackson's restoration was great. So I've really enjoyed that aspect of it. But, if I was to introduce somebody to the Beatles, I think I'd rather put them on to Get Back instead of Let It Be.
And it's hard to convince someone, to turn them on to the Beatles and be like, okay, I need 8 hours of your time.
Yeah, exactly.
Trust me, it's going to be worth it. So like there is a world in which like the compact version of Let It Be is maybe a good entry point. But also, wasn't there like a 90-minute version of Get Back that they screened in the theaters at some point? Where's that? I need that. That's what you need to show somebody to turn them on to the Beatles.
So what do you think about the increased use of AI in the Beatles songs and movies? Do you think there's going to be more of this to come? Is Now and Then really the last Beatles single?
So there's two things to unpack here. The last single, I think, is a weird misnomer that maybe was not like the best marketing tagline, because inevitably, they'll release another something from the archives when I'm sure, I would bet my house that they're going to redo the anthology next year. I would bet everything I have that that's coming. There's got to be something new on it, something that they've just found. They'll probably release it as some kind of standalone single. What it will be, I don't know. Is it the last like newly created thing? Probably. I don't see any point in anything else like being created like they've done with this. But I'm sure that whatever comes out on future releases of like archival stuff, if they release it as a single, the internet's going to be, oh, you said this was the last song 3 years ago. So they'll complain about that. As far as AI goes, though, I find that to be a really interesting topic, because I think I think where things went awry was Paul said that they were doing this song with AI, and people think AI was created because it was at the time when YouTube was like drowning in, what would it sound like if Freddie Mercury sang Wonderwall? Like we were getting those videos, and so there was all this, here's Paul McCartney doing Bohemian Rhapsody. Here's John Lennon doing, this, just all this weird stuff. So the idea of generative AI versus restorative AI was not discussed. And that's where kind of the conversation is what they're using is restorative AI to isolate existing things and then clean them up in a traditional sense. I think that is fine. I think that is great. I am all for it. I think that will inevitably open up a world for especially legacy acts like the Beatles, bands from the 60s and 70s who have countless, okay quality like live recordings that can now eventually be cleaned up and released in some form. Like you can get, hypothetically, we could get countless Beatles live albums out of this kind of technology because it can say, okay, this is what it sounds like when 50,000 people are screaming. Let's take that out of here. Now let's see what this guitar and this bass and these drums and these vocals, let's split all that. And we can get all these great recordings, which I think would be really interesting. Like, for example, there's this great live recording. I'm a big Monkees fan, and there's a great live recording of them. For those of you who don't know, the Monkees did in fact play their own instruments, and they did tour for several years in the 60s. In 1968, they did, I think, 2 nights at the Budokan in Japan, where the Beatles played in 66. And one of the shows was recorded and broadcast on Japanese television. And they are phenomenal that night. Like, they kill it. Where it goes awry is there are Japanese TV announcers announcing the songs and then talking over the song for the first 30 to 45 seconds of every song. We could now hypothetically remove that from this recording, remix this audio, and release this great live recording of a band whose legacy is changing over time and they're being respected as musicians. And you could actually see what a good live band they could be. So those kind of things are really interesting for the future. The idea of generative AI, of saying this is what John Lennon's voice sounds like, let's write a whole new song. I don't like that. I don't think that's a thing that people would buy. I think there's a world for it on the internet where people will, it's already happening. There's a account on Instagram called like AI Beatles, and people are just making AI Beatles songs, and they sometimes sound very close, but it's also very tongue in cheek and weird. And I don't think Beatles fans would ever buy that kind of thing. But as far as restoring previous technology and previous recordings, I think there's a world for that for sure. And I'm a fan of it. There's so much out there that just because it wasn't captured in the highest fidelity, it sits in a hard drive or in a vault somewhere that could easily be released. So I say, like, let's have it all. Let's clean it all up. Let Peter Jackson do what he has to do. Let him sell the software to everybody else. Let Apple put it on our MacBooks, and let's go.
Yeah. I kind of wish they restore Magical Mystery Tour with AI and the movie Help. I wish those 2 movies got an AI boost for them. Well,
especially the Magical Mystery Tour, like the audio, like vocally, or the audio in the movie can be real crappy in places. So like having that cleaned up would be nice. Help's just kind of jumbled in some places where it seems like there's just dialogue that kind of steps on each other's toes. So like clean it all up, make everything be audible. I want to hear whatever they're saying at any point. I want to hear it. So let's do it. Yeah.
So Jonathan, who's your favorite Beatle?
I think as a kid, it was always John. And in a lot of ways it still is. I still think he's visually like the coolest person I've ever seen. As I've gotten older and grown as a musician and been a band leader for a number of years, I think Paul and Paul's drive and kind of acumen for what's actually going to make this thing continue. And his own work ethic is just unbelievable. But also the breadth of material that he writes, like he's not afraid to try anything. And I think that's really, really fascinating. Like in some ways, when they went solo and John's commercial fortunes kind of started to dwindle a little bit, and he wasn't having hits and everyone else was, he kind of retreated to a safer space, which is understandable. But even when Paul has failed, he's never been afraid to just do whatever he wanted, which I think is so bold and brilliant. And I've got so much respect for that. So I think if I have to pick one right now, I'm saying Paul.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. How about, well, I can't ask you your favorite Beatles song.
You can't. Many have tried. Many have tried.
So how about your favorite Beatles album?
Favorite album? Revolver.
Okay.
Yeah. I think for a long time it was Abbey Road, but these days probably Revolver. It just rocks a little bit harder. Abbey Road is so pristine and it's amazing. It sounds so good. But there's the thing about Revolver that I always kind of go back to is it's like maybe the last time they're all pulling together in the same direction, I feel like. And they're all like at like the height of their individual they're at their height of their group power, but as individuals, if that makes the most sense. Like,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's the last time where they all have the same uniform appearance with their haircuts and their suits. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're still kind of the four-headed monster. And, nobody is really taken over anything. Like they're all kind of, John and Paul are like on equal footing in terms of like what they're doing. I think they're both seen at that point as like the two greatest composers alive at that time. George is one of the best guitar players on the planet at that time, if not one of the most respected. Ringo is getting incredibly imaginative with his drumming. And he's going to take that even further the next year, but he's really playing on another level in 66. And I think that's what makes that record so strong is everyone is playing so well, but they're doing it as a group. Whereas Abbey Road, you're getting more overdubs of guitar parts and more work individually and more work individually on songs of more like, well, I'm going to do this on my own song and I'll do this on my song. They're still working together, but everyone is like really on fire at that point. So that's why I think that record just has such a great energy and a great feeling. And I just keep going back to that one every time.
So, Jonathan, do you have a favorite memory associated with the Beatles?
This is my question.
Yeah, this is your question.
Wow. Okay. I've never gotten asked this one myself, so I have to think about that a little bit. And I probably have a lot, but the one that I will share today, because it was the first thing I thought of, which maybe that means it's my favorite. So I used to play in this band in the late aughts called Cowboy Mouth. They're from here in New Orleans. They had some radio hits in the late 90s. But still we're doing like really good touring business when I joined. I joined in 2007. And everybody in the band was big Beatle fan. Their singer and their guitar player, like we're all huge Beatles nerds. And so that was like an immediate, like quick, easy bonding thing for us. Was like we were just big Beatles nerds. So at some point, we settled on this idea of let's learn Golden Slumbers, Carry That Weight at the End. And so we started working on it like in sound checks over the course of a few weeks of like, well, let's just try and get the first little bit of Golden Slumbers today while we have 10 minutes, so we'd play it a few times and work it out. And then we must have gone through this for 2 months, maybe just keep working it out in sound check until we got to the point where like we were doing 2 songs of the 3. Then we were doing all 3 and trying to get our way through the whole thing. No real intention of what we were going to do with it. I was always saying like, man, we should encore with this somewhere. And like, this would be a great encore. Like no one's ever going to expect this from this like 90s alt rock band, it'd be totally unexpected. But I think if we do it, we're either going to fall on our faces or it's going to be amazing. One of the two. So I finally convinced them to do it. We played at the 930 Club in DC, which is one of the best rock clubs in the country, if not the world. It seats 1,200 people. It doesn't really seat. It's all standing room. Just a gorgeous room, big stage, phenomenal place. And people there just went nuts for the band. Like they loved us there. So we're playing the 930 Club. It's packed, absolutely sold out. So we go to do it for the encore. And it was this weird combination of like a song that I had known so well. It's one of those moments that you sometimes hear musicians talk about it where you're not playing the song's kind of playing you. Like, I didn't feel like I was actually doing the work. It just kind of happened. It just kind of flowed through all four of us, and we were note perfect. Like, we absolutely killed it. And I remember looking at people's faces in the crowd, and there was, when you started it, there was this mixture of, what is this? What are they playing? And then people going, oh my God, they're playing the end medley from Abbey Road. Holy shit. Like, people's minds were like blown, and we absolutely crushed it. And when we hit that last is equal to the love you make, when we did the harmony, like, oh, you got goosebumps. I'm getting goosebumps talking about it now. I haven't been in that band in years. But when we hit that harmony, like, and you knew you'd nailed it, it was like watching a batter that just hits a home run and he's watching the ball go over the fence, and you're like, I just did that shit. And man, walked off feeling like the best I'd ever felt as a musician at that point. It was such a good feeling, and it felt so unforced and so like easy, which is wild because it's a tricky 6 minutes of music, whatever it is. But, you know, it was when you had a group of people that loved that music so much, and we spent so much time working on it and putting so much attention to detail on it, it was really a great payoff to have. And so I think that was one that really kind of sticks out to me. I don't know if it's my favorite, but it's definitely one of them, you know?
Oh, that's awesome. Do you have a recording of that?
And we have no recordings of it. And the worst thing is, man, we never did it again. Never did it again. For whatever reason, you know, the band had a manager at the time who was just kind of a curmudgeon and weird guy. And he was like, yeah, that was great. Nobody knew it. I was like, it's on one of the best-selling albums of all time. People knew that, and we never played it again. I was like, we just did so much work, and we're never going to do this again. Are you kidding me? But that said, I've since done it with my Beatles cover band that I play with here in New Orleans. We've done it one time, and it was an absolute joy to play. So maybe it's just that bit of music just, you know, makes you feel amazing to play. That might be it. Sometimes certain songs just have this weird kind of magic that just makes you feel amazing when you play it. Maybe that's just one of those bits.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, that's just such a magical song, though, you know?
Yeah. I mean, the whole thing. And like, you know, there's a bit of jumping around that has to happen with it. Cause like, unless you have 5 people, you know, someone's got to go from keys to guitar. And we were a 4-piece band. And even with my Beatles cover band, we're a 4-piece band. So there's an element of like jumping off the piano and running over to the drums or running over to the guitar and like trying to not miss your cue. So it's like kind of there's a dance to it that you do. And when you pull it off, it's amazing. Like, it's like the best feeling.
Oh, that's so cool. I wish there was a recording of that.
I do too, man. Like, there's so many videos and recordings of the band from the time I was with them. That's like the one thing I wish I had. Like, I would get rid of everything else that we did in that time if I could have that one recording. Because that was one of those moments where like you walk off stage and you're like, we're the best band in the world. Right now, this moment in time, we are the best band in the world. And I legit felt that night. It was like, no one could do that but us. That was fucking amazing. And I wish I had a recording of it. Like, and this was, I don't know, 2008. So like, there wasn't a ton of people on their iPhones recording stuff. Like, the iPhone had just come out like a year or two prior. There's a lot of like low quality video of the band from that time, but nothing of that song, unfortunately. But c'est la vie.
We need Peter Jackson to go in and restore all that footage.
Right. Yep. If they ever release that technology and I can find it, we'll see what I can do.
So, Jonathan, what do you think makes the Beatles relevant to audiences and our podcast fans and online communities today?
That's a good question. One, I mean, it all starts with the music. If the music is not great, you're not going to get that level of commitment. So you got to have great music first. And obviously, for whatever magical addition that they have, whatever that the math that put them together, it's just the best. Like, that music is just the goddamn best. It doesn't get any better. I think also the story is so human and so aspirational and relatable. You know, you've got four guys from low to low mid income backgrounds who scrape and come from nothing to be the biggest band in the world. And then their interpersonal lives get real messy, and it doesn't necessarily resolve itself in a happy ending. So it's kind of like Shakespearean in its tragedy in some ways. You know, there's so many what if moments that change the story, that, you know, are things that people latch on to, and it gives you this emotional connection that transcends the emotional connection that exists through the music. Because like that is one portion of it. The emotional connection to the music is one thing. Then the emotional connection from the story is what really sticks it in, I think, and what really makes it last. So I think it's that. I think it's just so, you know, everyone finds their Beatle, you know, the one that you relate to the most. And then you kind of live the story through their eyes. And in some ways, like, you get emotionally invested in different ways through that. And I think as that kind of continues on, combined with the brilliance of the music, it's never really not relevant. It's maybe not always at the top of the trending topics of the world, but like it's always bubbling in some form, you know. And there's really no other band that can say that, which is kind of amazing. So I think it's this magic combination of relatability, even for, you know, four guys who seem superhuman in so many ways. You know, I mean, you look at Paul McCartney sometimes and it's really hard to realize like, oh, he's just a guy. He's just literally like someone's brother and someone's dad. And he's that kid's great grandfather. Like, that's bonkers. But he's also the greatest living composer in the world. And at one point in time was like arguably the best looking man on the planet. And he's done all these things. And you look at like John and it's like, oh, this is this guy who, you know, opened so many people's eyes to, you know, the power of, you know, kind of like the heartbeat power of rock and roll, but also of rhythm and blues. And then also of like social injustice, and also of like trying to shed the idea of toxic masculinity and like atone for being an asshole when you were a young man. Like, here's George Harrison, who opened up all these people's eyes to like other religions and other kind of states of consciousness. So, I mean, there's all these things that no other band has this. And the more we find out about the story, the more interesting it gets. And I think it's also really wild that like we just keep learning new stuff. Like 60 something years later, we learn new stuff all the time about this band. That's insane. No story goes on this long. None. And somehow this band the stories keeps going. So I think, you know, as long as those things keep happening, and even if we get every bit of detail we're ever going to learn, because eventually that will happen. Like, the story will be written, and it will be done. But as long as, you know, the emotional heft is still there and you've still got this brilliant music, I think it continues that way. I think it's maybe the one of very few things that 160 years from now will still be a thing that people listen to. I know that's a long explanation. Sorry.
No, I mean, it makes sense. You know, when I think about the Beatles in the way the world is now, it's almost as if like the Beatles, you can compare it to sort of religious text, in the sense that religious texts are based on events that happened a very long time ago, but the culture around it is still very much growing today.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's the same with the Beatles in a way. When I think of John Lennon, I mean, John Lennon died 16 years before I was even born.
Yeah.
But I think for myself and for a lot of Beatles fans, it kind of feels like we know him on a personal level, even though, you know, he wasn't even around.
Yeah. You know, and I think, you know, you spend so much time with someone's music or someone's art, and you do get to know them in ways that you don't necessarily if it's just like an actor reading someone else's lines. Maybe like you're kind of, when you listen, especially with music, it's like you're reading someone's diaries and they're like their most innermost thoughts. So I do think it's, it's easy to feel like you know somebody when you know their music. And I think you do. I think that's one of the most purest forms of getting to know somebody. And especially with John, who I think is maybe a way more hard on his sleeve kind of guy than we realize, or than is first obvious. Like, I think there's a lot deeper things in his songs that maybe we pick up, that it's deeper than we pick up on first read. So I do think it's, yeah, I think you're right. I think it's easy to kind of, it's easier to know somebody like that. And then you make that connection. Yeah.
So, how have the Beatles influenced your life aside from your music taste and venturing into the podcast world?
Yeah. In a lot of ways, I think, obviously, musically, they're kind of everything for me. It's the reason I play music is the Beatles. They've always been like the high water mark for me as a musician. But outside of that, I think in terms of my worldviews on things, I think listening and kind of studying the Beatles and really diving in as much as I've done in my life, I feel like has led me to be a more accepting person, a more empathetic person, a more sympathetic person. It makes me want to be a more forgiving person, maybe a more giving person. Yeah, I think there's a level of emotional vulnerability that you can kind of tap into when you take this music into your life, so to speak. Like, it kind of can soften the outer shell that the world can kind of create around people, because it can put you in touch with so much inside of yourself that other music doesn't necessarily do. So I think it's very much informed the person that I think I am and the person that I want to be. I want to be a good person. I want to love people around me. I want to accept people around me and make the world a better place for people around me and those that I love. So, and I think a lot of that comes from the lyrics in these songs and the messages in these songs and the messages that the members put out all the time. Like, in my 20s, when I was like a bit more like, thought I was maybe a bit cooler than I actually am. Like, I thought Ringo's Peace and Love thing was goofy as hell. Like, oh, this is kind of goofy, man. But now, at 42, I'm like, you know what? Yes, there's nothing cooler than the fact that this man every day says the words peace and love in every conversation he has. Like, he's putting that out into the world. Like, he's actually doing his part. He's putting that out in the world and putting that seed in someone's brain that, like, all it takes is just like, if you think that, if everyone thought that at one time, even for that small little moment, then you have peace. It's conceptually naive and not realistic in so many ways, but it's something. He's at least doing something. And I find that so refreshing that, like, the guy who's 83 is like, no, we can do this, guys. Trust me. All we got to do is just at 11 o'clock on my birthday, say peace and love. And I love that. So I think I think they're the best, man. Like, these guys are the best. They just are. Like, yeah. I've made so many friends through this world that have made my life such a better life than it would have been without it. They're great. They're everything, and they're great. And I am unashamed at the fact that, as like a 42-year-old man, my favorite band is the Beatles. Cause like a lot of people who are like cooler than you or hipper than you would be like, oh, that's so lame to say your favorite band is the Beatles. Well, you know what? Then I'm lame. Like, I think they are the best band in the world. Like, I'm all in every day for the rest of my life. Like, I just am.
I think that was the best answer I ever got for that question on this podcast.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, everything you said rings true for me too. I mean, from their lyrics, educating the person that you want to be, and just setting those guidelines for life through their songs and their lyrics. And, even their own actions when you dive into their lives and their interviews, it really is all just the best.
Yeah. And also like I say all the stuff about how great they are, but they're also incredibly flawed humans. And like, it's all part of that story is like,
Yeah.
yes, individually there have been moments in life when they've done not great things and they've been not great people, but they're human and everyone has done and been not great and done not great things in their life. It's part of the journey of being a human, and it's part of the journey of trying to be the best version of yourself that you can be. Like, to take it back to Ringo, I love the story about how, because now that he's 83 and he's Grandpa Ringo, and there's so much charm and enjoyment in, seeing Paul and Ringo in their like grandpa ages. Like, I think that's amazing. But when you watch videos of Ringo in the 70s and 80s, when he's like a pretty bad alcoholic, and then you hear about like, the story about how he decided to get sober. Like,
I don't think I know that one.
Woke up like he and his wife were both alcoholics, and they woke up one morning and he had like beaten her like badly. And I assume it was the first time this happened. I've heard them talk of no other times that this happened, but they had gotten in a fight. It got physical. He apparently hit her, and they apparently both were like, this is not good. Like, this does not work. And so they both went to rehab. I think they went together, and from what I understand, like he underwent like real, like serious therapy, but they went and got sober based on that moment of like, that was the rock bottom, was like hurting another person, the person you love the most. That is the rock bottom. And he had his rock bottom, and they went and got sober, and he's been sober ever since. And he's been more positive since then. And he's not, if you watch a lot of interviews from back then, there was always kind of like a bit of an element of not darkness, but like sadness and kind of like snarkiness of like, I don't want to be here, man. Just do the interview and let's talk about caveman and let me get the fuck out of here. Like, and now he just goes out and is positive all the time. And like, he made that change, and he changed his life, and like showing that like everyone can make that change. Even the most famous drummer in the entire world is susceptible to slipping up in the most human of forms and redeeming himself. I think John was on a similar path of redeeming himself when he died.
Yeah.
I think, Paul has come to terms with a lot of behavior that he's dealt with over the years that he's done. And they're humans who happen to exist on another level of creative brilliance that other people don't understand, but they're human. And that's what makes it so amazing is they're, at the end of the day, they're just like you and me. They just write really great music.
Yeah.
They just change the whole world. No big deal, but they're humans. Like, so yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if anything, I've definitely tried to say something similar to that before, but I don't think I've ever put it as eloquently as you just did on this podcast.
Yeah, well,
so
thank you.
Thank you for doing that.
I'm glad it was eloquent. I always feel like I'm just stumbling over words. So that's great.
But yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that a huge part of the Beatles story is this overarching theme of redemption.
Yeah.
And I really hope the Beatles biopics touch on that as well.
For sure. And I think that's one of the things that made Now and Then kind of so special, is it did feel like a moment of redemption and kind of closure for Paul. Like, it was a lot of, people said, oh, this is really Paul's thing. Well, yeah, it really was, because it was his friend that passed away. And maybe there's some connection with him, with the two of them in this song. That's, debatable depending on who you talk about, but he heard something and wanted, felt he owed it to his friend to see this thing through. And it took him 30 years. And that's like the hero's journey, akin to like Lord of the Rings kind of thing. Like, it took him this long to do this thing that he had to do. And like, I think that's an amazing way to kind of end this story, is like, they were closer friends than most people could ever understand. And even, 40 something years after John was shot, and 30 years after they tried it, he found a way to finish this thing for his friend. And I think that's a beautiful ending for that. So
So, Jonathan, when's the next podcast coming out? And can you tell us, do you have any plans for after you finish the Beatles ranking?
Yeah. Well, the next episode will be out this Thursday. When is this airing? So yeah, typically we release on Thursdays. We took kind of an extended break after the new year because I think we did 30 something episodes last year. And we took a break from like right after Christmas until April. We got a lot of flack for it. So we typically release on Thursdays after we complete the ranking. So I think about this from time to time. Some people have asked if I want to do like a solo ranking, and I don't think I want to do that just because that's so much material. So much material. Maybe an album podcast could be more an easier bite to take, but I don't know. I have thought that the topic has come up to do a similar thing with the Monkees, because I'm also a huge Monkees fan, and a couple of guests that I've had on have expressed interest in doing that. So I've thought about that. And I've also recently been thinking about, I'm a big fan of the band Big Star, and I've thought about maybe doing a Big Star podcast because to my knowledge, there is not a Big Star podcast, and their story is arguably on par with the Beatles story in terms of like, how is this real life? So I'm debating that, but I've still got, a long ways to go before that, at least probably 3 years, if not a little more, I guess. Like I've got my list in front of me here, assuming that I take no more breaks this year. If we don't miss a single episode after this week, I would be at number 64 on the rankings by the time that we're done this year. That's 30, I don't know, that's like 30 something episodes this year. Am I going to hit all 30? Probably not, but likely we're looking at 3 more years of the show. So I've got plenty of time to think of what I want to do. I've thought a lot about turning this podcast into a book at some form. I have some ideas for it. So at some point I might start working towards that. That's just kind of like a lofty maybe goal. So I don't know. We'll see. But there's more stuff coming, and I do want to put out some more music soon. I haven't put out any music. I'm a musician. I have a podcast, and I haven't put out music in 4 years. So I will probably put out some solo stuff in the near future. We'll see. I don't know. I have a band called the Breton Sound that has been kind of on hiatus since COVID, and then our drummer moved out of the state, so it's kind of on long-term hiatus. But we were active for 10 years prior to that almost. And I think we did 4 EPs in that time and some singles. We did a pretty great rocking cover of Wonderful Christmas Time. So if that's your jam, you'll probably love it. If you hate that jam, maybe you'll like it because we shortened it a little bit and it's guitar based. So it's pretty cool. But I've got some other ideas of other stuff I want to do. And so we'll see what happens with that. But everything I've done is available streaming. If you look up the Breton Sound, I have a couple things under my own name, Jonathan Pretus, and I also have done like some freelance writing for people, which has been interesting. I wrote a song with a group called Chapel Heart, who are like a country group that were on America's Got Talent last year, and they played our song on America's Got Talent, which was pretty wild. So like, that was cool to see. So yeah, my stuff is out there if you're interested in checking it out. It's Beatle-ish, I guess. It's very like rock and roll, like Foo Fighters meets Beatles meets Weezer kind of stuff. So.
Oh, that is so awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to leave all those links in the podcast description so
Sweet.
Everyone can check it out as they listen. And Jonathan, thank you so much for finally coming on the podcast. I'm so happy we did that. And thank you for all your awesome answers to those questions.
Thanks, Jack. I appreciate it. Man. I'm glad it was a good answer. I always worry that I'm just like rambling on inherently for no reason.